Welcome to another episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor.
Welcome, everybody, again to another episode of our show. Today, bringing you another really interesting guest involved in science and technologies, creating a better tomorrow. Today, we have the honor of being joined on the show by Dr. Amir Baniassadi. He is an instructor of medicine at Harvard Medical School, as well as assistant scientist at the Marcus Institute for Aging Research. There he works on the environmental impacts on health and well-being of older populations, and specifically works on areas like ambient air temperature and air quality, both indoors and outdoors, and ultimately their outcomes related to the health and well-being of both physiologically and socioeconomically vulnerable populations. His research applies really novel environmental modeling and measurement techniques, along with a remote and long-term physiological and functional monitoring of individuals, ultimately to establish relationships between exposure and outcome variables of interest inside clinical lab settings. Their ultimate goal of the research is to develop environmental interventions that optimize the environment for health and longevity of older adults. Dr. Baniassadi has a Ph.D. in civil, environmental, and sustainable engineering from Arizona State University, did his undergraduate bachelor's in mechanical engineering from University of Tehran, and then did postdoc training, which included a 3-year T32 fellowship in translational research in older adults and 2-year postdoc fellowship at Harvard University Graduate School of Design. A lot of really cool topics that we don't normally get into on the show, but we're very honored to have with us today Dr. Amir Baniassadi. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, so it's great having you. As you know, we were chatting before the show. These are some themes that we don't normally get into, so I'm very interested in everything you're up to and sort of the full story of how you got here. Would love to start off sort of early on in the story. We can maybe go back to Iran. You study mechanical engineering. You publish quite extensively then about the built environment, looking at everything from interesting materials that affect energy consumption and carbon dioxide emission in buildings, interesting things with regard to hybrid roof systems. And I've never visited Iran, but understand it could get quite hot there, especially in the summers.
It does.
Talk a little bit about your background, a little bit of what got you, not just in mechanical engineering, but looking specifically at this aspect of the built environment.
Yeah, so I have a kind of an unusual background. Right now, I'm a faculty at Department of Medicine at Harvard Medical School, but I started as a mechanical engineer in Tehran, Iran. So after I finished my undergrad, I was very interested in, how our built environment works. What are the underlying physics of our built environment? How do buildings exchange mass and energy with their surrounding environment? And what does that mean in terms of energy efficiency of the building, in terms of thermal resiliency of the building? The more I did that type of research, which of course heavily relied on my training as a mechanical engineer, Was using like heat transfer equations on a daily basis because I wanted to know how much heat a wall loses at a certain time of the year. But the more I did that research, the more interested I became in not only how the buildings and the systems in those buildings perform, but what happens inside them. What type of environment the individuals inside the buildings experience. And as you said, I come from the Middle East, very hot hot part of the world. Um, so there was a lot of concern even back then about heat and heat waves, and the city I grew up in, Tehran, even though it was the capital, sometimes during the summer, um, we had power outages because just so many people were trying to use air conditioning. And I remember my grandparents, oh, not just power, but also water. We had water outages because a lot of people use evaporative cooling to cool their home. It's not a very humid environment, so those systems work perfectly fine. It's just that a lot of people are suddenly using water to cool their home, and there is like this sudden increase in demand. So what the city would do is that we would have like scheduled outages by neighborhood, and for some reason, our neighborhood, we were apparently very close to the main lines. Our water never was shut off. So I remember during the peak of the summer, my grandparents, the water in their neighborhood would be shut off. So they would have to come to our house, to our apartment, which was on the second floor. We didn't have an elevator. It was very hard for them to kind of climb up the stairs. Um, and yeah, so just to be able to be in a cool environment and survive the heat, right? Um,
Hmm.
these are that was kind of when the interest started of about like what what does all of this mean in for the health and well-being of the people who are living inside this environment? And then gradually over the years, I moved in that direction. When I came to the US, I did my Ph.D.
Hmm.
Um, under David Saylor, who's a very well-known researcher in the field of urban heat. And I was a research assistant in the Urban Climate Research Center in Arizona State. And there I was very much focused on summertime power outages, heat waves, how the two can coincide, and again, what does that mean in terms of the environment inside buildings?
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, yeah, so that's the story of me going from undergrad to getting a PhD in America and focusing on heat.
Excellent. Excellent. And yeah, let's go to 2019 because you published your dissertation then. It's entitled Vulnerability of United States Residential Building Stock to Heat, Status Quo Trends, Mitigation Strategies, and Role of Energy Efficiency. And here, and just to I'll sum this up, but you can go into it a little further. You point out, hey, we've got a lot of thermal extremes happening, more than we have in the past. We have an existing stock of buildings, and in this research, you not only hung out in Arizona, but you also went to Houston, LA, and you evaluated, not just, hey, okay, we have air conditioning, and that's a protective factor, great, but a lot of other things happening inside these buildings, and we really need to understand of the existing stock. Kind of hard to put up new cities here and there. What the status quo is.
Yeah.
Take us through a little about this work, and what you learned. Any really interesting insights pop out in terms of, hey, we're not really prepared for the way things are going here, and we have to do better. But I'll let you
Yeah,
take us into.
so it all started with a with an observation and curiosity that my PhD advisor had at the time. So, and that is United States is kind of unique in terms of how its housing stock was and cities were developed and expanded by a lot during the 20th century. Um, a lot of the homes in especially kind of if you like think about a line going through the middle of the country from east to west, kind of, and focus on the kind of the lower side of the country, the more southern states. A lot of the development and the houses that were built post air conditioning. And that's very important because what air conditioning does is that, first of all, it allows you to have a city like Phoenix, Arizona, or Dubai in UAE and have millions of people living in an environment where it's not survivable for humans.
Mm.
There is a reason that we didn't have large populations in very hot and arid climates, right? But air conditioning made that possible. Not only you can expand there, not only you can have these huge cities and growing in very hot climates, the type of architecture and building material that we use in these houses was not it was not very sensitive to the climate, let's say. It was not adaptive to the climate, right? You can suddenly have a huge home with large windows facing south. Will need that much insulation because, hey, you have AC. It can artificially cool the place down, even if there's a lot of heat entering the building. You can always dump all of that out just using air conditioning. So it kind of enabled urban expansion and a specific type of architecture that we don't see a lot, for example, in Europe or Southern Europe. Um, uh, it's very strange and uncommon to see buildings or apartments that do not have operable windows or cross ventilation in Europe.
Mm.
But we have that here, again, because air conditioning made all of that possible. So the observation was we have a housing stock that's very much reliant on air conditioning, which is fine until things go wrong with the air conditioning. You know, when you start thinking about, can everyone afford air conditioning? What if suddenly everyone loses power and it's 110 degrees in Phoenix and you have millions of people living there? There's no neighbor you can go into and shelter. What can people do? So we did this assessment of the entire housing stock in major US cities that we thought were at the highest risk to see, using simulations, what would happen under different heat wave scenarios. What if people completely lose air conditioning? How does timing of that matter? What if you partially lose air conditioning, which is a scenario where you have an air conditioning, it's not working properly, but you cannot afford to fix it. Or you do not have the cognitive or physical abilities to fix it. And what we found was pretty concerning because basically, and at the time I thought my advisor is being dramatic when he decided that we should for one of our papers we used the title "The Growing Risk of Heat Disasters." um, but then as we did more and more research, we realized no, that's very much possible. And a heat disaster in this scenario is what we defined as power going out, like a major blackout in a very hot city like Phoenix at the peak of the summer. Millions of people would be at risk.
Mm-hmm.
People with disabilities, older adults. There isn't much you can do to protect yourself from heat if you don't have air conditioning. And then we also had this. So the status quo was that our building stock is not really climate resilient. It's not ready for what's yet to come.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, in some climates, even the trend is not going in the right direction. Because sometimes as you push for more energy efficiency, without really considering, okay, what's going to happen during the summer, you end up with a type of building that it's very good at keeping the heat in because that's what you want to do. You want to keep the heat in during winter. You don't want to
Hmm.
uh, kind of use a lot of heat, but then that's the opposite of what you want during the summer.
Right.
Uh, so not only the status quo was alarming, the trends is not where you want them to be.
Hmm.
And that was kind of a summary of my PhD research.
Excellent. Excellent. So and again, Mayor, I appreciate taking us through your background and exactly what you're looking at there because it sort of feeds in nicely to the rest of the story and the sequence we're going in here. So I appreciate you taking that time. Um, a couple of years later, in the journals of gerontology, this is the end of 2023, you published a piece entitled Heat Waves, Climate Change and Implications for an Aging Population. And in this paper, you talk about some of the things you were just mentioning in terms of heat islands, extremes of heat, and the changes that are going on, and go through a very complex sort of summary of the various challenges that specifically face the older adult population, as well as proposing research, which we'll get to in a little bit. And it's you introduce interestingly in this paper this principle of the exposome, a term we don't normally get into on the show, sort of looking at sort of all sort of the totality of everything that occurs in our environment that we may not think of, not just, hey, it's hot in here, and that's no good as a physical exposure, but biologic things, allergens, maybe all the chemicals that, hey, when it heats up, whether they're in the walls or the carpeting or whatever the case, may come out into the air. Talk a little bit about this paper, if you would, a little bit about this principle of the exposome. And you connected in the paper to, hey, we're only beginning to understand the exposome as it pertains to things like dementia, but everything in between. I mean, disrupted sleep, cognition issues, falling. A lot of bad things can happen when our internal exposome environment is messed up. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that and specifically why this is so critical for the aging population.
Yeah, sure. After I did my PhD, I spent a couple of years at Harvard School of Design as a postdoc and
Mm-hmm.
kind of worked along the same line as I was in my graduate student years. Then I became more and more interested in not only the environment, but what does that really mean for the person sitting in that environment, right? So we, me, my team, people I work with, we are getting very good at simulating, understanding the physics of how the built environment behaves. But then ultimately, the outcome of that work is a temperature or a concentration of some species of air pollutant, uh, right? It's a physical metric. Um, what does that mean for the person sitting in that room? Is it going to how does that translate to actual tangible health outcomes, things that are meaningful for people, right? That's where kind of the transition I transitioned again from doing more sort of like environmental engineering type of work to human subjects work, where the environment is now just part of the story. We are also
Mm-hmm.
going to people's home. We are um, trying to understand their health across multiple domains, their sleep, their subjective health, um, their physiological health, their behavior, and then focus on more factors than just the temperature.
Yeah.
There's a lot of weird interactions happening, especially during periods of intense heat. Um, it's getting better, thankfully, but there used to be a time where periods of intense heat uh, would coincide with periods of very bad air pollution in a city like Houston,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, what do you do there? Do you open a window because you want to cool, like it's night, you want to cool down your home, but you're also bringing air pollution from outside. That's a result of the heat. Um, how does the heat change your behavior? How does the heat change your day-to-day life if you're an older adult? Can you go to the grocery store and do the shopping? Can you go to the community and spend time with your neighbors and do the social things that you usually do? That's kind of why we started this more holistic view of what heat and environmental stress in general means
Mm-hmm.
for populations. And then the focus is, as you said in the paper, on older adults because they present a very interesting case. When you think about older adults, there is, first of all, this kind of physiological change that comes with aging. You know, we are, and we can get to thermoregulation and the fascinating things that human body does
Mm-hmm.
uh, later. But
Right.
basically, it becomes harder for our bodies uh, to respond to environmental changes, whether that's air pollution, whether that's noise, whether that's heat, humidity. It just becomes harder for our body to adapt to it. Um, there are complicated medication interactions. There are certain medications that uh, are more commonly used by older adults, like beta blockers, that affect how your body interacts with its environment.
Yep.
There are the functional limitations, which are currently my focus. So, how one's cognitive or physical decline influences their exposure, not just their sensitivity to the exposure, but increases their exposure because they're not able to go and open a window. They're not able to
Yep.
get out of bed and open the window, or they are not able to perceive heat, as well as younger populations do, and kind of change their thermostat set point.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, so this kind of combination of, physiological aging, functional decline, um, and medications. And also, there's this socioeconomic component to it as well, because older adults who have have less resources to kind of maintain their environment, they're also at the highest risk. We can get to that later as well. But this is kind of going back to the earlier point of like needing this. We need to kind of have a very holistic view of what's happening there. And that's the
Mm-hmm.
lesson that I've been learning as I've done more research the past few years on this specific topic and kind of the motivation behind that editorial piece that we published.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you mentioned holistic, and clearly, and I'm going to bring a couple terms in here that again I stole these from your papers, but
Mhm.
one, environmental gerontology, which is sort of maybe an overarching term to sort of the stuff you do, and then this principle of vulnerability sciences that another I haven't said those words together, but it makes sense that these two go hand in hand. So I think of these as sort of two interesting umbrella terms. And we've as we were chatting before the show, we profiled some of your colleagues at the Marcus Institute for Aging Research, like Sharon Inouye, who, director of the Aging Brain Center there. When it comes to these things like environmental gerontology and vulnerability sciences, quite interdisciplinary. And then again, looking at the different research areas at the Institute, biomarkers, brain health, data sciences, physical health and function. You got to work at the epicenter of all this stuff. Reintroduce us, if you would, to the Marcus Institute and a little bit of where your organization within the organization sits, because it seems like you are sort of like an octopus that are taking part in all of that. So please reintroduce sort of your organization in the organization.
Yeah, sure. It took me a year to really understand what the Marcus Institute does after I joined there. It was for me tough. I was the only one with the background like that, like a kind of engineering and environmental background. I couldn't understand I couldn't understand the language my colleagues and mentors there were talking. It's as if they were not speaking English. And I guess it was the same for them. But that's what made this very interesting. So to introduce our institute, Marcus Institute for Aging Research is the research arm of Hebrew Senior Life, which is a nonprofit organization that provides housing and healthcare to older adults in the Boston area, and it's one of Harvard Medical School's affiliated hospitals. So we have many different housing sites across the city of Boston and greater Boston area. We have this rehabilitation center in Rosendale, Massachusetts. And then within that, we have this research institute that focuses on anything related to aging, physical function, cognitive function, musculoskeletal health, nutrition, cardiovascular health, and recently environmental health since I joined. We have this group that works, for example, on mobility and falls, which I'm officially a part of also. So I guess the reason that there was interest on the side of the institute to bring someone like me here was that this kind of realization that when you think about older adults, you cannot just focus on what happens inside the clinic or inside the lab or your things that you can measure inside the clinic. At the end of the day, people are living inside their home. People are living in assisted homes. The type of relationship that you see between whatever variable of whatever exposure variable and whatever outcome variable that you're interested in. So, for example, how does cognitive decline increase the risk of falls, right? You can measure all of that inside the clinic and learn a lot about the underlying mechanistic nature of how this works. But that's not where people live. People live outside, real world, which is very messy, very much confounded. So there was this interest on the side of the institute to kind of focus more on the environment. And then for me personally, what attracted me was that, as I said earlier, I wanted to know what this exposure that I'm measuring or modeling or simulating means for people, right? Like, how does that influence the health and well-being of people? And then how do different factors contribute to vulnerability? So the thing about our relationship with our environment is that it's very heterogeneous. It varies a lot between person to person. The way an infant is influenced by their environment is very different than the way a school children is. Very different than a soldier who's now deployed in the Middle East and is trained and physically fit, and very different for a patient who has Alzheimer's disease and is 90 years old. So this is why it becomes important to kind of acknowledge and understand what are the specific characteristics of the population you're interested in, and how do those influence the relationship that they have with their environment. That's kind of how I like going back to the two words that you find in our work: environmental gerontology and vulnerability sciences. So vulnerability sciences basically talk about what characteristics are good predictors of one's vulnerability to environmental changes. I'm talking about the context of environmental sciences. And those are very useful because, first of all, it helps you identify the populations or persons who are at risk, but also think about interventions, right?
Yeah.
What sort of interventions are most fruitful and most effective when you're trying to help people become more resilient and less sensitive to environment.
Excellent. Excellent. So, continuing right off of that, so again, thank you for laying out some of these new terms for us. Two key parts to your research: studying one, the effect of ambient temperature on various health parameters and well-being in older adults, and then ultimately the biological control of that, sort of the smart home, the age tech. Well, actually, age tech applies to both sides of this. But I'd love to, talk a little bit about the first part. You've published again a few papers here on things like a platform to study the effects of home environment, health, and well-being of older adults. This was in Innovation Aging in 2021, and then there was another follow-up to that on the feasibility of high-frequency monitoring. And again, I'll throw this one back to you because I'll just say, okay, we have this theme of aging in place, very important. Now we want to study my mother-in-law who's 89. We have wearables and smart devices, and we want to modify the home and all. Talk a little bit about that because clearly a lot what you've done is very complex, and you've taken nothing, you've left nothing out in terms of environmental monitoring, biological variables, everything else. What was it like to sort of set up these programs? What was the feedback that you got in terms of some of this new age tech that maybe older people might not be that familiar with or maybe scared of a bit? Walk us through a little bit of what you learned in terms of some of your findings with just regard to the monitoring and setting up some of this age tech in that environment.
Definitely. So I want to start by talking a bit about the difference between what you learn inside the lab or in clinical settings and what happens inside one's home or on the street, like in the real world. So some of these topics that we've recently published on, the literature, the body of research and our knowledge on them goes back to decades ago. We recently published a paper about how ambient temperature influences sleep in older adults, which I'm guessing we'll talk about later, or how ambient temperature influences attention in older adults. The relationship between ambient temperature and sleep or cognitive abilities, there are papers on that from 30, 40 years ago. And most of those papers, or almost all of those research, were done inside the lab, which means you bring someone to your clinic or lab, you artificially expose them to different temperatures, different levels of environmental stressors, and then measure what happens to them. It could be, if you're interested in sleep, you have them sleep under different temperatures and then see how well they sleep. Or if you're interested in cognitive performance, you have them sit in a room, you change the temperature of the room, have them do some cognitive tasks and see how that is influenced by the temperature. And I should say a lot of this was initially motivated by the interest that people had in office efficiency and worker efficiency because the questions like how fast office workers type under different temperatures, right? So that's how this type of research started. So my observation, or I guess the gap that I was interested in the science, in this knowledge, was when you bring people to the lab and you do these fabulously designed experiments, you are controlling a lot, right? Of course, you have full control over the exposure variable, which is the temperature, and you have very good and reliable measurements of function or health or performance. But it's a very different story if you have people wear standard clothing for the experiment, if it's a sleep study and you have people go to the bed, use the same number of layers, if you're standardizing their routine before bed, very different than what happens in the real world, right? Where there's so much noise. But at the same time, that's where it actually matters, right? It's good to know mechanistically how does the human body react to different temperatures, for example, inside the
Hmm.
lab. But I wanted to know what happens outside. Now, as you imagine, that's very complicated because there's tons of different variables that are out of our control outside the lab. And to be able to kind of pick up the signal from the noise, what you need to do is long-term measurements. You need to have a lot of data points. You need to measure as many variables as possible: temperature, humidity, if it's related to environment, if it's related to health and function, how do people sleep, like as much as you can. How do they feel subjectively? Because only then you're able to kind of find associations and links uh, that are not just noise
Right.
and our signal. And I guess um, one way to think about this is so think about between person differences in cognitive function,
Okay.
right? So you go and you compare two people, you measure their temperature of their home, and then kind of in their own environment measure how they're doing cognitively. And you notice one of these homes is much hotter because the resident cannot afford air conditioning or doesn't want to use air conditioning, and they happen to have a lower cognitive performance, right? How do you even associate the decline to temperature when there's so many other confounders that are different between the two, right?
Right.
Uh, could be many hidden variables that are causing the temperature difference that could also influence the cognitive difference in the two people. That's why kind of doing these sort of long-term measurements and kind of multi-domain measurements are very important. And that's what's unique about our program at the Marcus Institute. Now, that requires technology, and that's enabled by technology that we did not have 20 years ago. Like uh, I don't know if you've seen pictures of polysomnography equipment, which are like you connect tons of different sensors to your body to
Right.
measure how you're sleeping. That by itself influences your sleep, and there's no way you can have people do that inside their home. But
Right.
now, even though it doesn't have as good as an accuracy than those very sophisticated instruments, my watch can do a very good job of estimating how I sleep. It does not impact my sleep at all. I can wear it every day. It's very easy to work with. It's cheap and it enables real-time data collection.
Yeah.
Um, so we started looking into this and kind of trying to see how we can use technology, like modern wearable technologies, smartphones, smart home devices, to have this sort of continuous high frequency. That means like happening. For example, we were measuring temperature every 10 minutes. We were capturing subjective well-being through smartphone-based questionnaires 2 times a week, 2 times a day. I'm sorry.
Mm.
We're measuring sleep every day. So we wanted to see, first of all, how if we can create a platform that's usable by older adults, what sort of kind of how we can integrate these devices to make them usable for older adults, and how they would do, because we had no idea how our study subjects are going to uh, how compliant they're going to be in terms of like responding to my daily questionnaires that I send to their phone, or are they going to forget charging their wearable devices that we give them. And that's kind of the topic of the first two papers, that the ones you just mentioned, kind of understanding, first of all, if it's feasible to do this in older adults and how we can do that to kind of maximize efficiency of data collection.
Hmm. Hmm. And then and again, that's an amazing body of work by itself. But then there's the other side of your work, which is basically how we take all that information, whether it's temperature, perspiration, various other cool pieces of biologic information that you're capturing, and do something and intervene.
Mhm.
And whether that's, and again, you can tell the right anecdotes and stories, but obviously somebody that's sleeping and it's too hot and they maybe have a little cognitive impairment because of it, and they don't know to get up, or they might get up and adjust the thermostat the wrong way, that lead all sorts of problems, fall trying to get to the thermostat. You have strategies for ultimately, coming back to this principle of the smart home, the aging in place. Where's some of this going? Clearly, the integrated back and forth, and the technology we have now that you're just mentioning, maybe with a little AI sprinkled in there, can make things a lot safer and better. Talk a little bit about some of your vision on the biologically adaptive control part of this.
Yeah, sure. So started with how we can monitor people, right? That
Right.
was what I just talked about. And then
Right.
kind of trying to see some of these relationships and associations without really changing anything. So just passively staying out, just monitoring and seeing how temperature is influencing older adults' sleep, how temperature is influencing their cognitive abilities. The next step after that is what do we do with that information, kind of research and findings.
Mhm.
Um, and there's there are different domains or levels of interventions that we can think about. There's of course this kind of at the very high level, the kind of the policy level. Addressing those economic components is super important because at the
Mhm.
very least you want people to be able to afford heat or cool, right?
Right.
Or have housing that's not too drafty, or have windows that you can actually open and it's not stuck, right? So like just addressing the minimums of having just what it means to live in a modern built environment, right? Everyone has access to healthy housing and all of that. Um, what I'm particularly interested in is that part where it's not just not having the resources, but it's the functional impairments that are causing people to uh, lose sleep because their room is so hot, or uh, lose their cognitive abilities because their home is too cold or too hot. Um, how can we make a closed loop system that kind of takes the human out of the picture? It does
Yep.
it is not reliant on the 95-year-old who has Alzheimer's disease to, first of all, perceive that there is something wrong. It's very hot, which is physiologically could be impossible for them to do because a lot of these neurodegenerative diseases actually impact the neuronal substrate of thermoregulation. So it's like
Okay.
physiologically a very hard thing to do, let alone kind of functionally and kind of ability to do something about it. And I think here is where we can do a lot with technology. So I'm very interested, and I'm kind of this is what a lot of my active research is currently about, how we can empower individuals by, in a way, making that decision for them. So think about an AI or machine that through monitoring you just monitors your body, your biological signals through a wearable or like a smart speaker that asks you, how are you doing? And it learns how you perform, how you sleep, how are you feeling under different temperatures, and automatically adjusts that temperature for you. So it's not reliant on you to actually understand what's going on or be able to act upon it.
Mhm.
And that's kind of the direction that my research program is going to, kind of using technology. And this is the most exciting time to be doing this research. I'm very fortunate. Just like go. do a search on how many smart home products are there, how many different wearable devices are there. They're getting better and more exciting every day. They're getting
Hmm.
cheaper. They're getting easier to work with. Um, uh, 10, 15 years ago, it was not easy to, 10 years ago, it was not easy to set up a wearable watch and connect it to your phone. It was clunky, it was heavy, it didn't hold charge as much as possible. Um, the smart thermostats weren't as kind of, did not penetrated the market uh, to the extent that they have now. But I think now we are ready. So the technology is at least there. The infrastructure is there. Now it's kind of the question is how do we connect all these pieces? Um, and as you said, AI makes all of this 1,000 times more interesting because of the power it gives you in terms of automation and individualized control. That's very important. So my point earlier was that the relationship we have with our environment is very heterogeneous.
Right.
How your body reacts to heat, the temperature that's optimal for you is very different than the temperature that's optimal for me for sleep, right?
Hmm.
But the cool thing about technology is that we can learn that. We do
Right.
not have to have a kind of a one size fits all technology. I'm sorry, one size fits all optimal temperature and kind of prescribe that to everyone. We can learn what temperature works for Amir and kind of continuously monitor that and automate that so I don't have to worry about it. I don't have to be able to even maintain that temperature. The system does it automatically for me.
Hmm. Hmm. And you mentioned heterogeneity, and I've personally have always been quite interested in, because I come out of the sort of the pharma realm, things like pharmacogenetics and toxicogenetics and the little differences that make a drug work in me and not in you and give you a side effect and so forth. Um, you mentioned things like thermoregulation. Clearly the genetics, I don't know how much we know about the genetics, the epigenetics of stuff like that, but like thinking out a little bit into the future. And I know at the Marcus Institute you have a major focus on things like biomarkers and genetics. Any sort of interesting thoughts about delving further into some of these sort of genetic factors? I mean, we hear about heat shock proteins and protein stability when it gets too hot, and all these other things, enhance things that control sweating capacity. What else? I mean, what else gets you excited? And looking out a little bit into the horizon, and in terms of again looking at some of these different capabilities that you have at the institute, to take some of this work, because I think there's heat, body temperature in general. We're learning just a lot about how that relates to sort of the rate of how we age. Anything else on that particular part of the story that's exciting to you?
That's very interesting, and that's kind of the next step after my next step. But before I get there, I have this favorite anecdote, this story that I forgot to say. That's
Cool.
my that's kind of what got me thinking about this taking the human out of the loop uh, scenario. We have I had I had a study participant who was, I forgot how old he was, but he told me he remembered reading about the start of World War II on the
Mhm.
newspaper. Um, so he was when World War II started, he was old enough to be able to read a newspaper. Um, he was enrolled in my study, this kind of same home environment health study that was about sleep and attention and temperature. Um, and there was we had a problem. He was not wearing. There was some problem with his wearable. We gave them a ring, like a wearable ring that they would wear, they put on their finger and it measure their sleep and several other biological signals. And for some reason, we were not getting data from his ring. And things happen. Sometimes the equipment stops working, or the person is not charging them properly. It could be the sensors get dirty. So I visited him at his home, and it was during it was July 2021, at end of July, and we had a very intense heat wave here in Boston. Very high level of humidity, and I think the temperature was more than 95. It was very hot 3 days. So I go to his apartment, and I notice the door to his apartment is open. So like he lived in a senior housing site, and he left his door open. I go to him and I see him sitting naked. He just had underwear.
Uh,
And I could see that he was miserable. His whole body was sweaty. He he was watching TV, and just I didn't even need to do any measurements on that, even though I have his data now. But just looking at him, his body was his heart and body was strained, right?
yeah.
Um, and I asked him, "Hey, you have air conditioning there. Why don't you? And you don't even pay for the bill. It's part of your kind of it's just part of your rent or whatever you pay to the facility." And he said, "Oh, I don't need it. I'm fine. I just open the door so I get some cool air from the hallway air conditioning." Um, and that's what kind of got me thinking about all of this. And he was someone who was cognitively healthy. So I think that his only problem was that he was not perceiving heat. So
Uh,
his brain wasn't getting the right signals uh, that his body is kind of under thermal stress. And then I thought, okay, what if this person didn't even have to think about any of this? What if the technology does this for him? So he doesn't have to sit naked, sweating with the door open, um, just to feel a little bit more comfortable. That's my favorite anecdote because the
that's a good
conversation
anecdote.
that I had with him, it was awesome.
Yeah.
um, yeah, so about I believe I've yet to come up with with a good term to describe it, but like let's call them thermal or thermoregulatory archetypes.
Okay.
Um, so the reason right now I'm interested in uh, understanding how individuals respond to their environment in a very kind of personalized and individual based way
Hmm.
um, is because we we don't really know what are the predictors of someone who, like, what are the characteristics that make someone more sensitive to heat?
Right.
What causes these differences in terms of thermal preference or the optimal temperature for sleep? So what we are doing is kind of to use technology to compensate that lack of knowledge, right? So we are saying, okay, we don't really know by just looking at you or knowing some basic information about your body or your genetics what the optimal temperature is for you, but at least we can just study you personally and measure it and kind of find it empirically. And then based on that, we're going to optimize the environment for you.
Hmm. Hmm.
But ideally, we don't even need to do the measurement and measure the biological signals from your body if we knew exactly what factors constitute your thermal archetype. We already know that sex is one of them, right? It's
Okay.
very well established that there is a difference between thermal preference and thermal comfort in men and women, right? It
Okay.
has to do with physiology, even different types of clothing that we wear. Um, we know that age plays a role. We know that certain diseases play a role, uh, like diabetes. We know that
Sure.
medication play a role. We
Yep.
know that there are some genetic components to this as well. When you study the populations from different climates and compare them, someone who's from Middle East may be very different in terms of how their body interacts with their environment than someone who who grew up in Siberia, right?
Right.
And um, so this is not very well studied at all. This I'm kind of hypothesizing here, but I'm in the camp that also believes climate history matters. So not
Okay.
just your genetics, not just your age, sex, these kind of very uh, clear and obvious factors, but where have you lived? The story of your life up until this point.
Right.
Did you grow up in New England? Did your family have AC? Are you used to having AC? I think that also matters, especially as we think about kind of aging and later stage of life, because our bodies are very adaptive. So kind of a nature versus nurture thing, right? So two
Sure.
people can have the exact same physiology, genetics, but then if they grow up in different environments, their body learns to adapt to them. So you
Yeah.
cannot treat them the same.
Right.
But if we learn all of this and understand all of these factors, then ideally you just fill a questionnaire and then we can predict what temperature is optimal for your sleep or your cognition.
Right.
But that's very complicated. That
Yeah.
requires data collection over decades from different populations. It's maybe we're a decade away from that right
Yeah.
now.
Well, I mean, you're on the right path in terms of setting up all the tools to ultimately capture that when um, when all that information becomes available. But it gets me thinking of things like so we chatted a lot on the show about sort of this comparative biology, and we ground squirrels, which get like to go to hibernate and get very cold, and they have really nice neuroprotective capabilities. But then bats, they get very hot and they're really good at fighting infectious disease. And so yeah, it's going to be interesting to see sort of where the learnings go with all this in terms of the human situation
We
as yeah, please.
we don't. It's interesting to me, and I think that's a product of being and having the luxury and being fortunate to kind of live a modern life, right?
Right.
Um, our body needs to, a core body temperature needs to be at a constant level all the time. And we take that for granted because a modern built environment, um, for the most part, is built in such a way like it's very cold outside right now, but I'm comfortable in my home. If I want to go to my office, get into my car, drive there, get to my office where temperature is also not very cold, right?
Mm.
And this is what the modern kind of built environment is giving me. But for most of our history, just that very basic function of keeping your body safe from heat and cold was a huge challenge for humans, right?
Yeah.
And it's like um, it's fascinating to me how human brain does all of this. It's like bipedal walking, where you're performing this very complicated task of walking within an environment, maintaining your balance, kind of monitoring and being mindful of all the obstacles that are around you, and you don't even notice it. It's just like you're
Yeah.
walking, you may be thinking about, you may be even like talking on the phone, doing something completely different. Same thing is happening with thermoregulation. Every second, our brain is receiving millions of different signals from different parts of our body. Um, and then it has actuators, right? How much I have to increase the blood flow to the skin, how much I have to, like, uh, what the breathing rate should be, how much, uh, like, how to control the sweating from the skin. Like, it has all these mechanisms that it's controlling in kind of an autopilot way. And it's only when the modern built environment fails to give us this comfortable temperature that we're used to, that we remember, oh, this is not easy. This is challenging. I'm very comfortable right now.
Yeah.
Because then your body starts tapping into more resources just to maintain its basic functions. and kind of takes away resources from higher level cognitive functioning, for example. That's why my research shows that when people are uncomfortable, it's harder for them to pay attention on what they're doing inside their own home,
Yeah.
right? Um, so yeah, I think this is all very exciting, and when you kind of factor in how our environment is changing, how the population is aging, it's going to be a hot topic. Excuse
Yeah.
the
Great pun. um, Amir, what's coming up? I mean, obviously we talked into the future here, but what anything else that we should know about coming up for 2025? I mean, I noticed you just put out this really very long paper and energy reports on solar heat gain coefficients and decarbonization, all sorts of other cool things like that. I mean, a little separate from uh, the the stuff we were
Oh,
just talking about, but what else is happening that we should know about in terms of either the Marcus Institute, some of your work in mechanical engineering and design, anything else that I missed while we have you today? But please.
so that paper is the last. It took us like 2 3 years to publish it, but that's work that I did.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
when I was in the School of Design before I
I was
kind of
looking. I was
started
like,
this
wow, this
focus.
is long.
Yeah, that's academia, right? Sometimes
Yeah,
it takes a long time for a paper to go through peer review.
sure.
There's lots of iterations. There's a lot of waiting.
Yeah.
So 2025, I'm first of all continuing this kind of research on the topic of automating control, kind of this biological feedback, this
Yep.
kind of taking the human out of the loop and optimize the environment in an individualized way. Um, I'm also very interested, and hopefully we're going to get funded and start this research program on how and kind of diving deep on how certain cognitive decline, certain diseases related to cognitive decline,
Mhm.
um, make older adults more vulnerable to environmental changes by increasing their exposure.
Right.
So I want to go and study two groups of people, um, where one of them is more cognitively impaired than the other. So like you have a control and an experiment arm in the study. And I just want to know how they behave, how frequently the cognitively healthy group open their windows to cool their home, or play with the thermostat, or turn on a fan, versus the people who are not uh, uh, as healthy cognitively, and or have mild cognitive impairments, to use this specific scientific term. So uh, that's what's my short-term horizon this year.
Cool.
Very
Okay.
excited about that.
Yeah, no, I'm excited for you. I really, again, as I mentioned at the beginning, that this is not a theme that we've gotten into on the show, and I'm excited to hear about it and see where it all goes, because clearly this umbrella of environmental gerontology touches on quite a bit that affects us in terms of health and well-being, and specifically older adults. And I'm glad to see you leading the path here. So again, excited for you and wishing you the best with these programs as you're moving forward in 2025. Again, for everybody that is going to be listening to this episode of our show across the various podcast networks, or watching on the YouTube channel. Again, you've been spending time with Dr. Amir Baniassadi, instructor of medicine, Harvard Medical School, assistant scientist, Marcus Institute for Aging Research. We'll put all the links in the bio of the show. But Amir, I want to thank you for taking time out of your schedule to talk to us for a while, educate us on everything you're up to. Thank you for what you do for this extremely vulnerable and growing population. And as we like to say on our show, thanks for helping to create a better tomorrow via the type of work you do. Awesome story, and I look forward to continue to follow you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Really enjoyed this conversation.
Me too. Me too. Great having you.